Associate Dean and Director of the Environmental Law Program here at the law school. We are delighted to have all of you here. Special thanks to our friends from the college campus, faculty and students who made the journey down the hill to be here. And thanks to our law students, alums, and special guests. We have a really wonderfully diverse audience here tonight. So thank you very much for being here. Before I forget, we are hosting a reception right after the lecture in the student lounge. And those of you who don't know where that is, you'll see the flow of people after. But I mentioned that because that's often a great time. If your question doesn't get time to be discussed tonight, don't worry. There's time at the reception to have some conversations. So all good there. So this is the 12th annual Huffman Lecture. And this lecture honors the contributions of Dean Emeritus Jim Huffman, seated right here, and the Western Resources Legal Center, which is an organization that Jim founded during his deanship, which provides law students here with practical skills training in natural resources law. I think I saw Aaron Bruner. There he is, Aaron, helping to run WRLC this year. Jim spent nearly 4 decades at the law school as a valued member of our faculty and as the dean for 13 years. In fact, he was my first boss. He was the dean in the mid-90s. Yes, that's how long I've been here. And through that time period. A wonderful dean in terms of really letting 1,000 flowers bloom was one of his mottos, and encouraged a lot of creativity and thinking about various projects that we could do here at the law school. His teaching and scholarship spanned areas such as property rights, natural resources, water law, free market economics, and constitutional law. His many accomplishments while he was the dean, in addition to the founding of WRLC, include securing funding for our beautiful Woodhall building right over here, in which the environmental program is housed. So we thank you every day for that beautiful building. Jim is also a well-published author. In addition to numerous law review articles and book chapters, he's the author of 2 books, Private Property and State Power, and Private Property and the Constitution. He also has a forthcoming book from Cambridge University Press, American Factions, How the U.S. Constitution Can End Extreme Partisanship. So this lecture series was designed and conceived by what I call fans of Jim, alums and friends who said, we love what Jim does. Jim really shakes things up around here, brings interesting viewpoints to bear, and we want to honor that work by supporting a lecture series so that every year we will have somebody come and, kind of like Jim did and still does, shake things up a little bit, make us think a little differently about things. And it has been a really successful and fun lecture. So we want to thank the folks who have contributed to the lecture series, the slide here. In particular, the main donors, Dan Harmon, Rick Sohn, Steve Wildish, Valerie Johnson, and Kirk Johansson. So one more thing I'll say about the lecture, and then I'll introduce, or have Jim come up to introduce our speaker. You may hear some things tonight that you disagree with. You may hear some things that really resonate with you because they're being said in a different way. There may be all kinds of things that you haven't thought of. That is the whole point of a lecture like this. So I encourage you to sit back and enjoy the evening. With that, Jim, I'll have you introduce Tim.
Thank you, Janice. When you're a dean, you very seldom make decisions that anybody or very many people agree with. But the one decision I made while I was dean for 13 years that everybody agreed with was hiring Janice. And she's still at it to the benefit of the program and the law school and our students. Every year I say this, but I'm welcoming you to the Huffman Lecture, not the Huffman Memorial Lecture. And I hope that I can continue to do that for a while longer. I wanted just say a couple words about the Environmental Law and Natural Resources program here, because I think it ties in very closely to one of the reasons I was very delighted that we could get Ted Nordhaus to come and speak. When I arrived at Lewis and Clark in 1973, there was a fellow here by the name of Bill Williamson who was teaching environmental law. One of the very first environmental law courses in a law school in the United States. It was at a time when Ted's father was actually instrumental in drafting some of our basic environmental laws, which are still taught today and studied and govern a lot of activities in this country. And I had just been at University of Chicago doing a lot of work, of all things, on forestry, which is an odd thing to be doing in Chicago. But so I had this interest in the sort of resource development, resource use side of things, and I thought, you know, if we're going to develop a program, the ideal program would be one that deals with the regulatory, environmental regulation side of things, and the resource use and development side of things. And a good lawyer in either of those areas should know both of those topics in a way that allowed them to really understand both their own clients and those people they may come up against. So we set out, and the name of the program, and it's still, if you look at the website today, on the headline, first page, it says environmental law. But buried under that, unfortunately buried under that, is Environmental Law, Natural Resources, and Energy program. And that was what we really conceived of at the outset. And I'd say it's worked reasonably well, although I think for many reasons it's drifted in the environmentalist direction and away from the resource user direction, which is one of the reasons why WRLC came into existence. I felt like we should be providing students with opportunities to get practical experience in the context of resource use and development, as well as in the regulatory environmental law side. And to be honest, I had some resistance to that, but eventually got it established as an independent 501c3, and with the law school agreeing to have students get credit for participating. And it turned out the biggest advantage of having it an independent 501c3 was we could raise money without having to deal with the institutional fundraising limits, which are not insignificant. So I think what, you know, in my now almost 5 decades of thinking about these issues, I'd say when we started out, when the program was established, there were sort of two camps. There were the environmentalists and there were the exploiters, as the environmentalists viewed it, or as the resource use people saw it, they were creating prosperity and these other people were standing in their way, objecting to any advancement and wanting us to return to the Stone Age. And that sort of split dominated the way people thought about it. And that's one of the reasons I thought it was very important for us to try to bridge that. You know, it was the era of Paul Ehrlich and Julian Simon. I'm sure you all know about the famous bet they made. That was kind of the norm at the time. And that's sort of a long-winded way of getting around to why I'm really delighted to have Ted Nordhaus here today as our speaker. Ted, I think, in the work he's done through the Breakthrough Institute and his earlier writing with Michael Schellenberger, has really been path-breaking in terms of getting people to think about issues on which they have very orthodox views on both sides, to think about other ways of approaching the environmental problems. I have for many years been involved with an organization in Montana that Ted is familiar with called PERC, and their mission is to use markets as a way of achieving environmental objectives. And that's the kind of thinking that was resisted, but I think has made some headways. And thanks to people like Ted, it's made even more headway in the last few years. Ted is the author with Michael Schellenberger of a book called Breakthrough, From the Death of Environmentalism to the Politics of Possibility, and I guess that's the source of the name of your institute, was from that book. But that's a very small sample of the things this man has written. Go to their website It's a little overwhelming. So I'm really delighted to have a man who's willing to sort of think outside the box, abandon the orthodoxies that govern so many things. And I'm doubly happy because I learned today that he's an avid cyclist and climber, two of my passions. So he's more than just a brilliant thinker. He's a biker, and that's a good thing. But that's all good.
Well, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be back at Lewis and Clark for the first time in, I gotta turn this thing on. It was like, I'll remember, and then I forgot. Thanks for having me. It's really a pleasure to be back here. It's the first time I've been back here in almost 20 years when Jim Proctor brought me to the college to give a talk, and we did a workshop. I can't even quite remember what the workshop was all about, but it was really, really important, big ideas, I know. So in the summer of 1963, my father, who Jim mentioned, Bob Nordhaus, came to Washington. He was fresh out of Yale Law School and came to Washington to help Lyndon Johnson build the Great Society. He started out doing tax law, but quickly shifted gears and increasingly came to specialize in environmental law, just as the foundational environmental statutes of the late 1960s and early 1970s were being enacted. I like to joke that my father was the first environmental lawyer in Washington. He never identified that way, and I'm not exactly sure how one would prove that claim or adjudicate it, but he surely was one of the first practitioners of what we now call environmental law in the nation's capital. During those years, he had a major hand in drafting almost all of those foundational statutes, the Federal Clean Air Act, the Federal Clean Water Act, Federal Endangered Species Act, National Environmental Policy Act. He's credited with personally drafting Section 111D of the Clean Air Act, which was the provision under which the EPA has attempted to regulate carbon dioxide as an air pollutant. He also played a major role in drafting most of the post-oil embargo federal energy policy of the 1970s. After passage of the Federal Energy Reorganization Act in 1974, he was delegated to the Federal Energy Administration to help create what would become the Department of Energy, and then served during the Carter administration as the first general counsel to the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, where he drafted and implemented the rules that opened up the U.S. electrical grid to merchant power providers and renewable energy. He was a lifetime Democrat. After a few years in private practice, he went back into government as general counsel to the Department of Energy in the first Clinton administration, just as the U.S. and the world began to grapple with the problem of climate change. That experience inspired him to build what is generally regarded as the first climate legal practice in Washington after he left government for good. When my father started in the late 1960s, there was little by way of an environmental movement and nothing in the way of environmental law courses, specialists, or clinics in law schools like this one. And yet, without either a movement, a corpus of legal theory and case law, or an army of practitioners, the United States passed a series of profound and far-reaching environmental laws over the course of little more than 5 years, unlike anything that has occurred before or since. And the results were impressive. By the mid-1990s, the nation's air and waterways had become dramatically cleaner. EPA rules had largely phased out leaded gasoline. The Endangered Species Act had brought back iconic species like the bald eagle and the humpback whale from the brink of extinction. By the time my father died in 2016, the U.S. environmental movement had become a multi-billion-dollar enterprise. You can walk around Washington today, you'll find entire buildings owned by major environmental NGOs and stocked with armies of lawyers, scientists, advocates, and political operatives. And yet, one would be hard-pressed to think of a single federal law passed by the US Congress over the last 30 years that remotely rivals any of the foundational laws passed in the early days of the environmental law and policy making. Not since at least the 1990 amendments to the Federal Clean Air Act, which took on and solved the acid rain problem and significantly expanded federal regulatory efforts to address air toxics. Since then, the major accomplishments legislatively in the environmental movement have been passage of subsidy programs for clean technology through democratic budget reconciliation packages, the most significant of which, the Inflation Reduction Act, was largely repealed just a few years later when political control of Congress and the White House flipped. Congressional efforts to tax and regulate greenhouse gas emissions, meanwhile, have failed spectacularly. So much so that neither the Biden administration or congressional Democrats, despite proclaiming climate change to be an existential threat befitting a quote-unquote whole-of-government campaign to eliminate emissions, even attempted to legislate emissions limits or taxes, despite controlling both the executive and legislative branches. Instead, most of the action has shifted to the executive branch and the courts. Democratic presidents have used their powers to designate national monuments, taken other actions to protect public lands from various forms of development and use, and we've witnessed incremental expansions of federal environmental regulatory powers achieved either via executive fiat by democratic administrations or through evolving case law and legal precedent via the courts. And whatever progress these latter efforts have achieved, I think it's fair to say that the pace of progress toward improving the environment over the last 50 plus years has been inversely proportional to the scale, sophistication, and resources of the environmental movement and the environmental law community. So what I want to really focus my talk on today are three things. First, why, despite so many more resources being dedicated to the problem, has progress slowed? Second, what exactly is it that all these environmental lawyers, upwards of 30,000 nationally, if Grok is at all reliable, have been up to? And third, whether the modes of legal and policy combat that have become so ingrained within the environmental movement are hindering or helping the cause. So let's begin with the why first. Why, after such stunning success in the first decade or so after the late 1960s flowering of the environmental movement, has progress been so much more halting? Well, one reason, the one that the environmental community tends to emphasize almost exclusively, is that the business community mobilized to resist further strengthening of environmental laws. And this is surely true. Early environmental advocacy swept through Congress much the way that European diseases swept through the Americas. There was no resistance. Almost all of the modern methods that corporations today use to influence government and policymaking, political action committees, sustained and professionalized lobbying operations, public advocacy campaigns, fly-ins, and other efforts to bring local leaders and citizens to Washington to lobby their representatives and to lobby administrative agencies, were invented originally by the public interest movements of the 1960s and 70s. But it didn't take long for corporate America to catch on. And as a result, the blitzkrieg that characterized the first decade of environmental policymaking morphed into the trench warfare that has characterized the last 4 decades. A second reason progress has slowed has been the increasing polarization of American politics, something that I know Jim has written quite a bit about. You can go back and read Richard Nixon's statements about the environment in the early 1970s, and he often sounds like a degrowther. Nixon didn't, by most accounts, mean very much of it, but the fact that he felt the need to speak about the environment in this way points to just how different the political environment was. The political context in which America's great environmental accomplishments were achieved came at the very really tail end of the post-war liberal consensus. Thanks to the New Deal, the war effort, and the extraordinary success of America's mixed post-war economy, Americans had far greater faith in government. The Cold War and the presence of an ideological competitor to the American-led liberal international order imposed strong incentives on both parties to cooperate to some degree on issues like civil rights, poverty, and the environment, the better to demonstrate America's superiority to Soviet communism. The two political parties were also less coherent ideologically and more organized around parochial concerns. It's not coincidental that the last great environmental legislative achievement, the 1990 Clean Air Act, came just as the Cold War was drawing to a close and was largely a regional battle, uniting Democrats and Republicans representing the Northeast, which bore the brunt of the acid rain problem, against Democrats and Republicans from the industrial Midwest, where the pollutants responsible for the problem were being emitted. But a third reason has been just how successful those environmental efforts were. Even before the wave of environmental laws in the early 1970s, many pollution problems had vastly improved. Consider that the 1969 Cuyahoga River fire, which famously sparked much of that era's activism and policy advocacy, was the last significant river fire in American history. And it was hardly significant. It burned for about 15 minutes and had been extinguished before anyone was able to take a picture of it. As Case Western Law School's Jonathan Adler has documented, industrial river fires occurred regularly throughout the late 19th and early 20th century. The photo of a burning river that Time magazine splashed across its cover a few weeks later was identified as the Cuyahoga River, but was actually that of a far larger river fire in Pittsburgh that had burned for several days more than a decade earlier. Smog produced from automobiles, by contrast, was a relatively recent problem as car culture took hold amidst the Cold War economic boom. But air quality, too, mostly due to both industrial activities and the widespread use of coal and wood to heat homes, had been far worse in most American cities in the decades prior to America's great environmental awakening. Now, to be clear, even though the public health and visual impacts of environmental pollution may not have been as bad in 1968 as they were in 1948 or 1928, they're still quite significant. For this reason, major new federal efforts to reduce those impacts brought big results in short order. Scrubbers and catalytic converters were fairly straightforward end-of-pipe technological fixes that imposed modest costs. And eliminating major applications of a handful of industrial pollutants with clear environmental consequences, such as DDT, leaded gasoline, and mercury, brought huge benefits. But as those improvements were realized, few further environmental regulatory efforts have brought diminishing returns at increasing cost. After the year 2000 or so, the benefits of new environmental law policy were increasingly tenuous. New environmental laws and regulations brought largely theoretical benefits. But while you could justify those benefits in theory based upon extrapolating pollution impacts from dose response models, the actual consequences were difficult to observe in the noisy real world, where they were confounded by all sorts of other social, demographic, genetic, and behavioral factors that often have far greater consequences for public health. One major Canadian study, for instance, estimated that 90% of environmental cancer burden was attributable to just 3 sources: solar radiation, naturally occurring radon gas in homes, and particulate air pollution. Only the last of these represents the sort of, according to Hoyle, environmental pollution that the environmental movement has spent the last 50 years attempting to regulate. And even though that pollution results from many natural and human activities, wood-burning fireplaces, wildfires, agricultural tillage, that the environmental movement has not much concerned itself with. So to kind of sum up the why, the costs of achieving these increasingly modest environmental gains were greater, and there was a well-organized and resourced opposition dedicated to emphasizing those costs to the public and policymakers. The political climate was increasingly hostile, particularly as the merging of the of the environmental movement with the Democratic Party sparked an equal and opposite reaction within the Republican Party. And the public was increasingly skeptical of both the overheated claims of environmentalists and the efficacy of government to effectively address environmental problems at acceptable costs. So then let's get to sort of what has the environmental community done in response to this? What have we been up to? We, very broadly defined. The response to these challenges from the environmental movement broadly and the environmental law community more specifically was not to recalibrate. Rather, it was to burrow in and attempt to repurpose the foundational legal frameworks of the early 1970s towards purposes for which they were never really intended. So now, over the last decade, we've seen the Obama and then Biden administrations attempt to use the Federal Clean Air Act to regulate carbon emissions from power plants and tailpipes in lieu of legislating a durable approach to climate mitigation. Environmental groups and Democratic administrations use the Clean Water Act's Waters of the United States provision, which was explicitly intended to protect navigable waterways to regulate and limit development around ephemeral streams and seasonal wetlands. The Endangered Species Act, inspired by the plight of charismatic megafauna like the bald eagle, the blue whale, and the gray wolf, is now invoked to protect subspecies and even varieties of plants that often can't be differentiated without a genetic test. And the National Environmental Policy Act, intended to inform federal agency decisions and increase public participation, has become, as my colleague and also Lewis and Clark alumni Elizabeth McCarthy put it, a litigation hydra and an all-purpose tool through which well-heeled private interests, often in the name of the public interest, are able to endlessly relitigate public policies and projects that have been approved by policymakers who are actually accountable to the public. The result has been a form of politics by other means, through which the environmental movement has substituted legal and regulatory legerdemain for the difficult work of building durable cross-partisan political coalitions. Under the best of cases, this strategy has resulted in pitched federal regulatory battles that have seesawed from one administration to another over policies that won't much impact the real world. Consider the now decade-long effort to use the Clean Air Act to regulate carbon emissions. The Obama administration proposed the Clean Power Plan, designating the combined cycle natural gas plant as the best available mitigation technology, and attempting to transform a command and control regulatory framework into a trading program for which there was no statutory authorization. The Trump administration abandoned the Clean Power Plan and proposed instead a minimal heat rate requirement for coal plants. The Biden administration then proposed to designate entirely unproven carbon capture technologies as the best available technology in a transparent attempt to assure that the fossil generation would become so costly that utilities would have to make a wholesale switch to clean energy. And the irony here is that there's not much evidence that had the Clean Power Plan gone into effect, emissions would be much lower today. The coal to gas transition which the Obama administration attempted to impose by fiat, was proceeding just fine before the Clean Power Plan was proposed, and has continued apace after it was abandoned. And if solar, wind, batteries, and electric vehicles are all that the environmental movement claims them to be, the same fate will befall the now abandoned Biden-era power plant and tailpipe rules. But just as often, the outcomes of this approach to the environmental movement's declining social capital have been worse than that, because the slow accretion of regulatory rules, legal precedents, and procedural practices over decades has created real environmental harm. Consider three major efforts to scale up lithium production in Nevada. One was blocked over entirely speculative concerns that exploratory boreholes would impact the water table and threaten a species of endangered pool fish that lives in a sinkhole nearby. One was blocked due to a subspecies of wild buckwheat only identified by plant biologists a few decades ago. And one was blocked over claims that it threatened the habitat of the sage grouse, an endangered species with a range of over 11 million acres across the Mountain West. For years, these dubious environmental impacts held up efforts to develop a domestic supply chain for lithium, the key critical mineral input that is needed to manufacture all the batteries that are supposed to save the pool fish and the wild buckwheat and the sage grouse from climate change. Or consider the fate of the Diablo Canyon nuclear power plant, which its owner, Pacific Gas and Electric, proposed to shutter due to state environmental rules that it would have required it to build a multi-billion-dollar cooling tower to avoid fish larvae entrainment from seawater intakes that have cooled the plant for the last 40 years. There was no evidence of any decline in local fish populations over that period. The state's environmental regulators had simply made a dubious estimate of how much larvae would be entrained based on a census of the density of larvae in surrounding waters, and then extrapolated that into an even more dubious estimate of the impact that the intakes were having on local fisheries, despite a complete lack of evidence that the plant had had any impact whatsoever on actual fish populations. This then became the ostensible regulatory justification for imposing billions of dollars of new environmental regulatory costs upon the largest source of clean energy in the state of California, leading to its planned closure. Only after it became clear that the state would have a difficult time either keeping the lights on or hitting its climate targets did the state's environmental leaders reverse course on this absurd journey down the environmental regulatory rabbit hole, a decision that the state's powerful environmental community continues to monolithically oppose. So this, it would appear, is in significant part what those 30,000 environmental lawyers have been up to for the last generation, either promulgating rules like these, litigating them, or helping governments, businesses, and property owners comply with them. And as I look out at this great, amazing room of ambitious and talented legal minds, I have to ask whether this has been a particularly good use of those talents or the enormous resources that institutions such as this one have invested in training them. My answer obviously is no. But I'd be remiss in offering this sort of provocation without suggesting what I think you all ought to be doing instead. So let me close with some thoughts about what really does matter for the environment and where it is that the environmental law movement and environmental law needs to go from here. So first, the single most important thing to understand, in my view, about ecological politics and policy in the 21st century is that the big challenges are generative, not restrictive. Problems like climate change and biodiversity loss are global, and solving them requires building a new world, not preserving the old one. Similarly, the new ecological problems won't be solved in the old ways that worked so well for the environmental movement in the 60s and 70s. Climate change is not simply a big air pollution problem that we can regulate or tax out of existence. And biodiversity loss won't be solved by drawing a circle around the Amazon or the Siberian taiga in the way that earlier conservation efforts created national parks and other protected areas. If you want to solve climate change, you need to build an entire new energy economy capable of providing far more energy to meet the needs of 8 billion people globally, most of whom want to live modern lives just like all of us do. This is not optional. China, India, other emerging economies, they're not waiting for our permission to develop. Similarly, if you want to protect global biodiversity, you need to figure out how to produce food for 8 billion people who want to eat higher on the food chain, which means producing more food on less land so that we don't convert more of our forests, wetlands, and grasslands into agriculture, which is the largest impact on ecosystems and biodiversity by far. A lot of talk about climate change. Nothing compares to agriculture. So the question for the environmental law profession over the coming decades, in my view, is not what will you stop, but what will you build? This then leads to a second key issue, which is what parts of the enormous environmental regulatory edifice that we have built up in this country are you ready to get rid of so that we can build that world? There's a lot of concern in the environmental law community that in the rush to reform environmental laws like NEPA and the Endangered Species Act, we will throw out the baby with the bathwater. And my response to those concerns is that if you want them to be taken seriously, you need to be ready to say what you're willing to get rid of. Which part is the baby and which part is the bathwater? There must be something, some significant part of the environmental legal canon that has been built up over the last 50 years that is no longer fit for purpose and can be dispensed with. Finally, I want to end by reminding you all that while politics and policy are important, the big long-term drivers of environmental progress are macroeconomic and technological, not political or regulatory. As I noted before, before any of those foundational laws had been passed, the air and water in the post-war era was already far cleaner than it had been in earlier decades, because an increasingly prosperous societies was building all sorts of infrastructure for all sorts of reasons that brought environmental benefits along for the ride. Better technologies were making industry, space heating, and all sorts of other activities more efficient and profitable, as well as being less damaging to the environment. The same is true today of carbon emissions. The long-term carbon intensity of both the US and global economies has been falling at a consistent rate since long before anyone had ever heard of climate change. That is in part due to all sorts of public policies, particularly public investments in new energy technologies, mostly for all sorts of reasons having not much to do with climate change. When I was a young activist and advocate, I found this idea distasteful, even identity-threatening. The whole reason I got into environmental politics, after all, was to change the world. And the notion that things had gotten better environmentally and otherwise, for reasons having nothing to do with the sort of sacred activities of activism and advocacy and building social movements, seemed to challenge the entire point of doing what I was doing. But my older self sees all that differently. The flowering of environmental concern, activism, and ultimately lawyering in the early 1970s brought a one-time bonanza, accelerating trends that were already underway. There was lots of low-hanging fruit, low-hanging pollution fruit to capture at very low cost. But the environmental movement learned the wrong lessons from those early successes and over-indexed on legal and regulatory strategies, and then built an enormous legal and political infrastructure to prosecute those strategies to increasingly little effect. My point here is not to encourage any of you to abandon environmental activism or policy or legal efforts altogether, but it is to urge a bit more humility and a lot less technocratic hubris. Environmental law and policy succeeds when it swims with the far more powerful currents of modernization, development, economic growth, and technological innovation. When it positions itself oppositionally to those trends, it fails. Growth, development, and technological change are both the source of and solution to environmental challenges. And environmental law must place itself in service of those processes in order to serve the environment. Thank you very much.
Time for questions, comments, observations. Jim, I always like to let you have first. Do you want to make a comment?
I'm interested to see what sort of response there is.
So I think a number of environmental laws at least gave lip service to the concept of cost-benefit analysis. How are we doing on that?
I'll give one example, which is the kind of ongoing battle over the social cost of carbon. So in addition to like my father being the original environmental lawyer, my uncle, William Nordhaus, is sort of the original environmental economist, and he's sort of the person who has probably done the most work for the longest period of time of trying to calculate the social cost of carbon through the DICE model that he built at Yale. We've had this kind of pitched battle over determining what the social cost of carbon is to ostensibly inform the sort of cost-benefit analysis of various sorts of climate regulations and other actions. It's just completely, you can kind of get any number out of it you want by just sort of turning the dials differently on these, climate economic models. So, tell me what you think the rate of technological change will be, or, what your preferred social discount rate is. There are all sorts of ways that you kind of can manipulate the model. And so, when the Republican administrations have been in power, they turn all the knobs way down, and then, Biden comes back in, or Obama, and they turn the knobs way up. This is clearly, whatever we're doing here, it's not like sort of scientifically arriving at a particularly defensible estimate. And I think this is true of a lot of the kind of cost-benefit analysis that is sort of done on kind of both sides of the, among those on the environmental side who recognize that they need to sort of justify that the benefits justify the costs, and those who think they don't. I don't know that, in the context of, kind of very contested environmental policies, that this is a particularly credible way of sort of resolving that contestation.
I'll ask, I'm sure you're familiar with a book written, I think, in about 1970-something by William Baxter called People Are Penguins, Case for Optimal Pollution. And Baxter is a contemporary of your father, I guess. And in that book, as the title suggests, he was saying the objective of zero pollution is a non-starter as a policy matter. If you ask me, do you think he was anticipating the kind of dead end that you see in the environmental movement coming to?
I actually don't know that book, but I should read it, apparently. But yeah, I think that's, we certainly have gotten to a point where, at least in the sort of, if the sort of environmental regulatory community sort of had its way, you're just constantly ratcheting down and ratcheting down and ratcheting down and ratcheting down closer to zero, as close to zero as you can get. And the reality with most pollutants is sort of below a particular threshold. You can argue about exactly where that is. the impacts, as I noted in my talk, are pretty theoretical. You can't actually observe them in the real world. I spend a lot of time doing work on nuclear energy, and one of the big kind of long-standing kind of grievances that a lot of nuclear advocates have had is around this, and it's been a pitched sort of battle between the advocates and the opponents, has been this sort of, what's called the linear no threshold model for radiological dose exposure, which basically says, we can go sort of see an impact at very high doses, and we can see a human impact, right? We have the Hiroshima survivors, we've got Chernobyl, we've got a lot of kind of data where, at higher doses, you can actually see that it, causes cancer and various other health effects. And so then the sort of standard linear model just says, okay, well, if it's, X at this dose, as you kind of go down in dose, it gets, it's just linear, the dose response. And the thing that's interesting, you get these pitched battles about whether there's a threshold here, below which there's no impact. But the really kind of amazing thing that kind of both sides in this debate get annoyed at me for pointing out is that whether or not there's an actual threshold, once you start getting to very low doses, you are literally talking about environmental health impacts, radiological health impacts that are literally unobservable. Like you could take a large population of, 20 or 40 million people, and you could track them for 40 years. And it's very, very unlikely that you would see any statistical, between a control group and an exposed group at these low doses. And of course, you can't do this like an experiment. You would actually need a population to be exposed to it. You still would almost certainly not actually be able to observe any statistically significant increase in cancer mortality or cancer diagnosis between a control group and the exposed group. And so it's sort of like, at some point you got to say whether or not there's a theoretical health consequence here. I mean, my view is you can't actually observe it, even, statistically in a large population tracked over a significant period of time. It just shouldn't be a regulatory concern. Whether or not there's still some pollution out there and whether or not, depending on one's assumptions, you can kind of extrapolate a health consequence that you can't observe. So, I think my view on all of these things is that there's got to be some stopping mechanism here where you kind of decide that, a little bit of pollution is okay. And, we can debate about how much is enough or too much, but it's not clear that there's really, we get these sort of cost-benefit things where it's like, okay, well, we'll do it when the cost becomes greater than the benefits, and it's like, then we get into social cost of carbon and these various efforts to sort of estimate the value of a human life, and it just completely, it's all actually arbitrary. It's sort of, what's they call it, the something I'm blanking on it, of misplaced concreteness, the law, anyway. It's the fallacy of misplaced concreteness. It's not real. These are just sort of made up numbers to justify policy decisions.
Hi. I agree with a lot of things you say, and some things I don't agree with. And that usually means you're a successful speaker tonight. It makes me think more about certain things. I work in the environmental justice space, so it's quite a bit different. I'd like you to end more on something more positive and give us something that you feel like that's really working very, very effectively. I do see that we do need to change things. I also see that in the policy space and just in the space that we're in right now. Yes, we've gone back and forth between Republicans and Democrats, and it's on everything. It's not just the environment; it's on everything. And so something is going to tip eventually to go one way or the other. And hopefully, as we're all hoping, it's going to go in a certain direction. But I'd like to think that there's some things that are happening that are very positive, and that we are doing some things that are working. And I'd like to hear from you on more of those?
Well, I mean, this is an older example, but like phasing out leaded gasoline was an incredible accomplishment. And to be clear, that would not have happened without environmental law. Like, there was no particular reason to phase it out, except that there was a big health effect. It happened pretty quickly. Today, I'll give you an example of, maybe it's not what you're looking for, but I wrote about this, I don't know, 20 years ago, so it's not that recent. But, and it's an environmental justice, ostensibly an environmental justice concern, which is, childhood asthma and disproportionate rates. When you go and you look at the, yes, there are real disproportionate rates. Well, first of all, a lot of that is sort of driven by things like emergency room admissions and things, is tracked, things like that. And, for a lot of, kids in environmental justice communities, I guess that's what we call them now, poor communities, non-white communities, they end up in the emergency room a lot more because they tend not to have good health coverage. And so, the chronic condition is not being effectively treated. Then you kind of go and look at, well, what are the environmental causes of the asthma? And, kind of the environmental justice community has tended to focus on diesel, industrial, sources of pollution, or diesel buses and trucks and things like that. And that is definitely part of the problem. But the lion's share of the problem is actually substandard housing stock. It's dust and mold and indoor air quality and pollution, which is just a much more constant impact for kids. And so you kind of go if you sort of stop looking for, if you just said, let's say, grant, as there really are in many cases, disparate impacts. And my criticism of the environmental justice movement is it goes, okay, we're going to go look at only those things, or primarily when we it's the intersection of these disparate impacts and something where we can point to an environmental cause. And the result of that is you focus, I think, often too much on the buses and not enough on improving the housing stock or improving treatment programs and things that if what you really care about is the outcome, which is kids not, ending up in the hospital or the emergency room with severe asthma attacks, you would take a much more holistic approach to this question and to this issue. And we have really, really good examples of that. So when I published my book 20 years ago, we wrote about the Harlem Children's Zone. And we really contrasted it with what was kind of one of the real model EJ groups of the time, which is called WEACT. And Harlem's Children's Zone was yeah, we should do something about the diesel buses and the diesel trucks, but let's also get into homes, and let's kind of work to force landlords to improve substandard housing up to kind of reasonable codes and reasonable public health standards. And let's get kids through school programs and various other things diagnosed and medicated to deal with the problem. So I don't know if that's as positive as you would like.
How about I give you something positive? So,
all right.
You look at Portland Clean Energy Fund. It's a program that's here in Portland. That's where I work. And we're doing a lot of the work that you're talking about right now. There's places around the country, there's places around the world that want to replicate what we're doing right now. So things like that are happening, and I think we need to replicate that more.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, it goes to the government, and it's frustrating for me to be in the government.
Yeah.
And we're still doing really good work, and we're engaging students in this as well.
Yeah, I think, I'll give just a couple more examples. One in a sort of, I guess, what you would call an environmental justice space, which is, globally, internationally. And again, this is a kind of controversial thing, but you look at just giving, getting, liquefied propane gas for cooking into places where people are cooking today with wood and dung, where indoor air pollution and the impacts of air pollution are so much worse. And it's is there sort of, some kind of like biodiesel alternative, and not in anything that's sort of scalable or cost effective. And so if you're kind of like, yeah, like it's both cleaner, from an environmental, even a carbon perspective, than burning wood and dung, and it massively improves public health for women and children who are primarily being exposed to air pollution, like getting LPG, into villages and communities that, don't have electricity and don't really have modern cooking technology. Massive, massive, and we've had huge successes doing that. Another example closer to home for me is just like, which is I think a positive change, less so in the sort of institutionalized environmental movement than I think environmental policy making. It's just I've been involved for 15 years now in sort of launching the pro-nuclear environmental movement, where people are like, no, this technology is not, dangerous and this terrible, horrible thing. It's like been for a long time, like still in many, many places, the largest source of clean energy, clean electricity we have. It's incredibly safe. We certainly shouldn't be shutting it down. And like, there's actually all sorts of contexts where it increasingly makes sense to build more of it. And like, I think both the Democratic and Republican, Republican Party was kind of always there, but wasn't doing that much about it. The Democratic Party, and both for very different reasons. On the left, it's really been driven by climate concerns, and on the right, it's been driven by sort of energy security concerns. But it's been a huge, I think, and promising development.
Thank you.
We have time for one more. Yeah, one more question. Oh, we'll do both of your questions. Go for it. All right.
My understanding of some of the gist of your suggestion is that we discard our traditional paradigm of environmental law and sort of bargain away aspects of it in order to come to a statutory scheme that better addresses the novel and serious problems of the modern era. Are there models elsewhere in the world that you see as adequately addressing climate change and biodiversity as two topics that you mentioned in your speech?
Yeah, I mean, it's a lot easier to build infrastructure in a lot of other places. And, there's a bunch of different reasons why it's so difficult and costly for the U.S. to do so, but certainly, anyone who's tried to get any kind of major public infrastructure built in this country will just tell you that, like, the time, effort, cost imposed with just kind of figuring out how to comply and doing the assessments, a lot of other places, there are actually much stronger public engagement requirements. So like one of my colleagues has a paper out right now called Reboot NEPA, and he literally came from the Biden EPA and was like the guy who was like, how do we kind of navigate all of these sort of permitting and other environmental hurdles to kind of go get all this green infrastructure built that we want to build? And he kind of came out of that experience going like, we have got to really kind of reform NEPA. And he's not a guy who's like just burn it all down. But, and his thing is like, this is a statute that was always included, intended to, require public agencies to do environmental assessment of the impacts, certainly at the very least the direct impacts of the projects that they were, proposing and often appropriated and directed to build, and to, kind of engage the public. It was never intended as this sort of endless tool for kind of relitigating what are often decisions made. These are publicly accountable. You can be like, well, but nobody votes them out when they do stupid things. But, these are at least people have to go to some degree theoretically and explain their decision and their policy making to voters who can get rid of them. Like his kind of framework for kind of, well, what do we do is like, we should have much clearer and more consistent expectations of public agencies for how they do environmental review and how they address public comment, and what constitutes, a reasonable assessment and response to those public comments. And then we should severely limit the litigation options, to kind of really clear cases of sort of malfeasance and cases where it's like things that policymakers clearly knew were sort of excluded from review. So we should really sort of severely limit what you can litigate. And that's an example of, I think, a kind of, I think we're in the midst of, whether you like it or not, certainly at the federal level, that whole structure is literally being burnt to the ground right now. And the agencies have been, frankly, from between DOGE and shutdown and layoffs and things like that, these agencies have really been decimated in terms of just sort of their staffing and anybody inside the building who kind of even remembers how you do any of this. And so I don't think that it's like, AOC, President AOC in 2028 is going to actually be able to put Humpty Dumpty back together again. And so, I think the opportunity right now for people like you as sort of the next day is to really kind of rethink how do you do this and what should we do if you kind of started with a clean sheet of paper? What would you do? What kind of sort of legal and regulatory framework would you put in place to assure reasonable environmental protections without, in many cases, allowing those rules and those protections to literally prevent you from going and doing many of the things that you need to do to actually improve environmental outcomes. And so that would be my challenge to anyone here in this room who's thinking about a career in environmental law right now is, I think you're going to have an opportunity to start over. And so thinking about how you start over and where you start from, I think is exciting. And I think kind of creates a lot of kind of really new opportunities that, I think it's a generational opportunity actually to kind of reset environmental policy making and law for, certainly the next 50 years.
All right, final question.
I just want to, again, thank you for being here. You mentioned a little bit about how, prior to the passing of the Clean Air and Clean Water Act, that, the free market had already kind of started pushing, I guess, cleaner standards in general due to, technological innovation. And I guess we can kind of see that happening today with an expansion of the green energy grid. I'm kind of interested in your thoughts on, artificial intelligence as a potential tool to solve environmental problems, and is that something that environmentalists should get behind?
I'll say one thing, which is that it wasn't just the free market. So first of all, it was just an increasingly, prosperous society that had economic surplus that it could put into all sorts of infrastructure. And, it's not there were various city and state ordinances before 1968, anti-smoke ordinances. So there was some environmental, what we would call now environmental law. I didn't call it that at the time prior to 1968. So there's some policy making, but a lot of it really is just infrastructure and technological change. Today the AI is an interesting question, right? So there's a big Lawrence, I think it's Lawrence Berkeley Lab study out on sort of, they're really looking at, because there's the endless debate about whether, if you have more renewables on a grid, does it make things more expensive or less expensive when you really look at electricity prices? But one of the things that they find is that irrespective of, how much renewable versus other sorts of electricity generation you have on a grid, the grids that are growing, that have been growing, where demand has been growing faster, have both tended to be have lower electricity prices and decarbonized faster. And part of that's just if you're adding new generation, whatever kind of generation it is, it's probably cleaner than, most of these grids are still 60, 70% fossil at least. So even if what you're adding is a new natural gas turbine, it's probably more efficient and cleaner than whatever the baseline on the grid is. And obviously you're adding wind and solar and batteries and other things as well. So, you know, that brings you to the AI thing, where suddenly you see this big increase in demand. I mean, there's two ways that AI can really help. You know, I think there's a lot of concern that, oh, it's just such an energy hog. And the first thing is that globally, it's just it's not actually the main event. You know, in the US and some other places, it's going to really stress electrical systems, certainly in the near and medium term. You know, the benefit, and I will not make any remarks about whether, like, you know, the AI robots are going to come and kill us all, or it's going to cure cancer. But certainly, I mean, there's a lot of reason already to think that, like, you know, kind of AI-assisted design and engineering and things like that are solving everything, making it much easier to do everything from kind of very sophisticated, like, grid management to, like, figuring out much faster, like, how to hold a stable fusion plasma in a plant that could actually generate electricity, or how to design or evaluate, you know, accident risk in a you know, small modular non-light water reactor. So there's a lot of applications there that should accelerate, you know, kind of technological, all sorts of, you know, certainly if it is the general purpose technology that people believe it is, that should accelerate technological change in the energy and clean tech sector. And then the other thing is that, you know, you look at that new demand, and then, you know, these guys are like, well, we'll take every, you know, if we can get a gas turbine, we'll take it. But, you know, they're also like, you know, one of the things that has really sort of turned the picture around sort of economically in the prospects for, like, kind of getting new nuclear technology commercialized really quickly is that these new data centers, I mean, they're huge gigawatt scales. They need electricity all the time. It needs to be really, really reliable. You know, like a small modular reactor is a pretty great technology for an AI data center. And you can site it wherever you're going to put your data center. We just need to actually, like, build some of them and make sure they work, but because they don't exist yet. But you know, and even like you look at, you know, they're now, you know, we're now restarting nuclear plants that have been closed recently to power data centers. So, you know, and I think that's going to, you know, provide a bunch of kind of uplift for, you know, solar and battery systems to some degree, although they're not really great substitute, you know, options for data centers, but will drive kind of continuing expansion of the grid and more renewables on the grid as a result. So I think there's a number of ways that, you know, that new, very significant new load demand is going to accelerate decarbonization and clean technology development, because kind of like, you know, it's natural gas or it's something clean. You know, they're not going to run these, you know, there's not a lot of coal plants or coal capacity to go run these things on.
Well, please join me.
Thank you.